The planet was called Kethvora, and it was nothing special to look at, just endless red dunes and flat exposed rock stretching in every direction under a pale orange sky that never seemed to change its mood. 7 species had come here together under the banner of the Galactic Cooperative to build something new, a shared colony on a world that the surveys had rated as safe and boring and perfectly predictable in every way that mattered. The Selvari arrived first, with their elegant silver solar arrays that unfolded like the wings of giant insects, catching the light of the twin suns and humming with quiet energy that powered half the outpost before anyone else had even unpacked their cargo containers. The Droon came next, heavy-bodied and thick-skinned, dragging their mineral extractors across the sand and drilling deep into the bedrock with a kind of stubborn patience that impressed even the most seasoned engineers in the group. The Iolithes set up atmospheric processors that scrubbed the thin air and made it richer and easier to breathe, and their scientists walked around with instruments strapped to their long fingers, measuring everything from wind speed to soil temperature with an obsessive attention to detail. And then there were the humans. Engineer Mara Kassan stood at the edge of the ridge on the colony's eastern side with her arms crossed and her eyes scanning the terrain below like she was looking for something that nobody else could see. She was not tall, and she was not loud, and she did not carry herself with the kind of authority that made people stop talking when she entered a room, but there was something about the way she looked at the world that made you feel like she was always solving a problem you had not noticed yet. "We are building the shelter here," she said to her team, pointing down at a flat stretch of ground tucked behind the ridge. Her second-in-command, a young man named Dalton Reeves, looked at the spot, and then looked back at her, with his eyebrows raised. "Underground?" he asked. "Underground," she confirmed, and that was the end of the discussion. Over the next several weeks, the human contingent did something that confused, and then amused, and then outright annoyed every other species in the colony. They dug. They dug deep into the rock and sand, and they lined the walls with reinforced composites, and they installed blast doors that could seal shut in under 4 seconds, and they built air filtration systems with triple redundancy, and water recycling units, and independent power generators, and emergency ration storage, enough to feed 200 beings for a month. The shelter was massive, and it was buried, and it was built to survive things that had no business happening on a Class 2 safe environment world. Counselor Fissi, of the Selvari, was the first to raise the issue at the weekly cooperative council meeting, and she did it with the answer. The kind of careful politeness that her species was famous for. "We have reviewed the human construction project on the Eastern Ridge," she said, her silver eyes blinking slowly. "And while we appreciate the dedication and craftsmanship involved, we must confess that we are struggling to understand its purpose." She paused and folded her long, thin hands together. The planetary survey, conducted over 400 years of observation cycles, found no seismic instability, no significant weather deviation, no predatory fauna, and no atmospheric threat of any kind on Kethvora, she continued. "So we are curious as to what exactly the shelter is meant to protect against." Mara stood up from her seat at the far end of the table, and every pair of eyes and sensors and optical stalks in the room turned to look at her. "Everything," she said. There was a silence that lasted just a little too long. Gorek, the Droon foreman, broke it with a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough, a wet rumble that came from deep in his barrel chest. "Everything," he repeated, shaking his heavy head. "The humans want to hide from everything on a planet where nothing happens." A few others chuckled, and even some of the human representatives on the council shifted in their seats with embarrassment. Mara did not sit down. "You build for the day nothing goes wrong," she said, her voice calm and steady and completely unshaken by the laughter. "We build for the day everything does." Feast tilted her head in that way the Selvari did when they were trying to be kind about something they found foolish. Engineer Cassin, your dedication to safety is admirable, but perhaps those resources and labor hours would be better allocated to expanding the water purification grid or reinforcing the western landing pads. The shelter stays, Mara said. The council voted and the result was 6-1, with only humanity supporting the project. But since each species had autonomy over their own labor allocation, the vote was symbolic, and the humans kept digging. Within days, the shelter had a nickname that spread across every species in the colony like a virus. They called it the human hole. The Selvari whispered it with amused pity, the Droon bellowed it with open mockery, and even the quiet and reserved Iolathi used it in their private communications when they thought no one was paying attention. It became a joke and then a metaphor, a shorthand for human paranoia, for the strange and irrational fear that seemed to live inside every member of that peculiar species from the little blue world on the edge of the spiral arm. Why do the humans lock their doors on a planet with no thieves? Someone would ask, and the answer would always be the same, because they are humans, and humans are afraid of everything. Mara heard the jokes, and she said nothing. Shelter ran a full systems check, sealed the outer blast doors with a quiet nod, and walked back to her quarters as the twin suns set behind the dunes. Dalton caught up with her on the path and walked beside her in silence for a while before he finally spoke. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "Does what bother me?" "The laughing, the name-calling, all of it." Mara looked out at the horizon, where the sky was turning from orange to deep violet, and the first stars were beginning to show through the thin atmosphere. "My grandmother built a storm cellar behind her house in Oklahoma," she said, "and her neighbors laughed at her for 20 years, until a tornado took every house on the street except hers." She paused and let the desert wind brush against her face. "I would rather be laughed at for 100 years than be right for one day and have no place to hide." Dalton nodded slowly, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. Behind them, buried under the ridge and invisible from the surface, the human hole sat dark and quiet and waiting, its blast doors sealed, its air filters humming softly, its ration stores full, its walls thick and strong and ready for a day that everyone else believed would never come. 6 months passed, and the colony grew, and life on Kethvora settled into the kind of comfortable routine that made people forget they were living on an alien world. Trade routes were forming between the outpost and 3 nearby systems, and supply ships came and went with a regularity that made the landing pads feel like bus stops. And the different species had begun to find their rhythm with each other, in the way that strangers slowly become neighbors. The Selvari hosted evening gatherings under their solar arrays, where they played soft music on instruments that looked like liquid glass. And the Droon had opened a community hall where anyone could come and share a meal made from imported ingredients that smelled terrible, but tasted surprisingly good. Even the Iolathi, who were usually so reserved and formal, had started joining the humans for their weekly game nights, where they discovered an unexpected talent for a card game called poker that nobody had anticipated. The shelter on the eastern ridge sat untouched and forgotten, like an old joke that had stopped being funny long enough ago that people no longer bothered to tell it. But Mara had not forgotten. Every morning before the twin suns cleared the horizon, she would sit alone in the colony's small monitoring station and pull up the atmospheric data feeds and study them with a kind of quiet intensity that Dalton had learned not to interrupt. She was not looking for anything specific, because that was the whole point. On Earth, they had a saying that the thing that kills you is the thing you did not see coming, and Mara had built her entire career around the practice of looking at everything and hoping to find nothing. For 5 months she found exactly that. Nothing, just the steady, predictable rhythms of a boring planet doing boring planet things. But in the 6th month, the numbers started to whisper. It was small at first, so small that any reasonable person would have dismissed it as sensor noise or calibration drift. A tiny pressure differential in the upper atmosphere that appeared and disappeared like a heartbeat that skipped once every few days. Then the electrostatic readings began to creep upward, not in a spike that would trigger an alarm, but in a slow, patient climb that was almost invisible unless you were watching for it, which Mara was. And then, the dust. The mineral particulate count in the lower atmosphere had been increasing by a fraction of a percent each week for the past 2 months. And on its own, that number meant nothing. But Mara had learned long ago that numbers on their own never mean anything, and that meaning only comes when you lay them side by side and look at the shape they make together. The shape they were making now looked like a warning. She brought her findings to the Cooperative Council on a warm afternoon when everyone was in a good mood because a supply ship had just delivered fresh provisions, and the Droon commuting hall was serving something that the Selvari had actually complimented for the first time in colony history. "I have been monitoring atmospheric anomalies over the past 8 weeks, Mara began, standing at her usual spot at the end of the table with a data display projected behind her. "And I believe we may be seeing the early formation of a significant weather event." Dr. Yeneth, the Eolathi atmospheric scientist, leaned forward and adjusted the optical sensors on the bridge of her narrow face. "Define significant," she said. "I cannot define it precisely because we have never seen it before," Mara said. "But the pressure differentials, the electrostatic buildup, and the increasing mineral particulate density are forming a pattern that is consistent with pre-storm conditions on multiple terrestrial worlds in our records." Dr. Yeneth made a sound that was the Eolathi equivalent of a polite. "Engineer Casson, with respect, Kethvora is not a terrestrial world in your records, and our atmospheric models are built on 4 centuries of continuous observation data," she said. "Minor fluctuations are accounted for in the baseline, and they do not indicate a weather event of any concern." Gorick leaned back in his massive chair and crossed his arms over his chest. "Here we go again," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Mara did not flinch. "On Earth in the 1930s we had atmospheric models too," she said, "and they told us that the Great Plains were stable farmland that would produce food forever. And then the sky turned black, and the soil blew away, and millions of people lost everything, because the models did not account for what they had never seen before." She looked around the table at 7 species worth of faces staring back at her, with expressions that ranged from polite patience to open annoyance. "On Mars, our early rover, missions were nearly destroyed by dust storms that our models said were impossible at that latitude and altitude," she continued. "And on Titan, our first outpost was buried under a methane snowfall that the surveys had given a probability of 0. "Those are human worlds and human mistakes," Counselor Thies said gently. "The Cooperative has a somewhat longer history of planetary science." The council voted, and once again it was 6-1, and once again Mara was alone. She walked out of the meeting hall and stood in the hot wind for a long time, and Dalton found her there, staring up a horizon with that look on her face that he had come to recognize as the one she wore when she was not angry but deeply and quietly afraid. "They said no," he said, not as a question. "They said no," she confirmed. "So what do we do?" Mara turned and looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that sent a cold feeling down his spine, despite the desert heat. "We get the shelter ready," she said, quietly and quickly, and without asking permission. Over the next 3 weeks, Mara and her team worked in shifts, restocking the shelter with additional water and rations and medical supplies, running every system through a full diagnostic twice, and conducting emergency drills that the other species noticed and chuckled at the way you chuckle at a neighbor who checks their smoke detectors every week. She installed a secondary communication array inside the shelter that could operate independently of the colony's main network, and she upgraded the air filtration system with extra mineral particulate filters that she had fabricated from spare parts. Dalton asked her one night as they were hauling water containers down the shelter's main corridor, why she always did this, why she always prepared for the worst, even when every expert in the room told her the worst was not coming. Mara set down her container and wiped sweat from her forehead and looked at him with tired eyes. Because every species in this colony evolved on a world that was kind to them, she said. The Salvari homeworld has no seasons. The Droon homeworld has no weather. The Ialathi have never experienced a natural disaster in their recorded history. She picked up the container again and kept walking. Earth tried to kill us every single day for 200,000 years, she said, and the ones who survived were the ones who were afraid enough to prepare and stubborn enough to keep going. And I am not about to let that instinct die on a planet that everyone tells me is safe, because safe is just a word that means we haven't been hurt yet. That night, Mara sat alone in the monitoring station one last time and watched the numbers on her screen, and they were still climbing, still whispering, still forming that shape that looked like a warning that nobody wanted to hear. And then, at exactly 3 in the morning, the station picked up something new, a harmonic vibration, deep and low and resonant, coming from somewhere far out in the open desert, a sound that was not wind and not seismic activity, and not anything in any model that any species had ever built. It pulsed once, and then again, and then it was gone. Mara stared at the screen, and the screen stared back at her, and the desert outside was quiet and still, and the twin moons hung in the sky like 2 pale eyes, watching something that had not yet arrived, but was already on its way. The morning began like every other morning on Keth Vora, with the twin suns rising slow and golden over the dunes, and the colony waking up in that lazy, staggered way that places do when there is no rush and no danger and no reason to move faster than the light. The Salvari were already tending to their solar arrays, polishing the silver panels with long, graceful strokes of their thin arms, while humming a melody that sounded like water running over glass. The Droon were eating their first meal of the day in the communing hall, loud and heavy and content, their deep voices rumbling through the walls like friendly thunder. A group of Ialathi juveniles were playing a counting game in the central plaza, while their parents watched from the shade of an atmospheric processor, and somewhere a human was brewing coffee in the mess hall, and the smell drifted out through the open door and mixed with the dry desert air. It was a good morning, and nothing about it suggested that it would be the last good morning this colony would ever have. Mara was already in the monitoring station when the first reading hit. The pressure differential did not creep this time. It jumped. A sudden violent spike that made the display flash red and sent a sharp alarm tone cutting through the quiet room like a knife through paper. She leaned forward, and her fingers moved fast across the controls, pulling up every sensor feed she had, and what she saw made her blood go cold. The electrostatic charge in the upper atmosphere had tripled overnight, and the mineral particulate count was no longer climbing in fractions, it was doubling every 10 minutes. And the harmonic vibration from the desert was back, not pulsing this time, but constant and growing louder and deeper, like something enormous was waking up beneath the sand. "Dalton," she said into her communicator, and her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that he had never heard before. "Alarm. Right now. Not the cooperative channel. Our channel. The emergency broadcast. Mara, what is? Do it now." Within 30 seconds, a sound that no one in the colony had ever heard before began blaring from every human-installed speaker in the outpost, a rising and falling wail that the humans recognized instantly as the universal signal for seek shelter immediately, but that the other species had never been trained on, because no one had ever thought they would need it. Confusion spread like fire through dry grass. The Salvari stopped their polishing and looked at each other with wide silver eyes, and the Droon pushed back from their tables, and the Ialathi parents gathered their juveniles close, and everyone started asking the same question in 7 different languages. What is that sound, and what does it mean? Mara was already running. She sprinted from the monitoring station to the central plaza, and she climbed onto a cargo container, and she shouted with every bit of air in her lungs. Listen to me, all of you. There is a storm coming, and it is coming fast. And you need to follow my team to the eastern ridge right now. Do not stop to collect anything. Do not go back to your quarters. Move now. Gorek pushed through the crowd, his massive frame towering over the humans around him. A storm? He said, and there was disbelief in his deep voice. There are no storms on Kethvora. What are you talking about? Mara pointed west. Everyone turned to look, and for a moment there was nothing to see, just the familiar line of dunes and the pale orange sky stretching out to the horizon the way it always did. And then the horizon disappeared. It did not fade or blur or darken gradually the way a storm approaches on most worlds. It was simply there 1 second and gone the next, swallowed by a wall of black that rose from the ground to the sky like a curtain being drawn across the face of the. It was not brown dust or red sand or gray cloud. It was black, pure absolute black, a churning mass of mineral shards and electrically charged particulate matter compressed so dense that no light could pass through it, and it was moving toward them at a speed that the brain struggled to process, because things that big were not supposed to move that fast. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved, and nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind dying, just stopping completely, like the planet itself had held its breath. Then Mara screamed the word that needed no translation in any language. Run. The next 20 minutes were chaos and terror and desperate scrambling action that Mara would later remember only in fragments, like a dream breaking apart on waking. Her team had trained for this, and they moved with the kind of mechanical efficiency that comes from drilling a thing so many times that your body does it, without asking your brain for it. Permission. They formed corridors of people, human marines and engineers standing at intervals along the path, from the central plaza to the eastern ridge, shouting directions and grabbing arms and physically pushing beings of 7 species toward the shelter entrance. The Selvari ran in long, elegant strides, their silver robes streaming behind them, and most of them made it to the shelter quickly because they were fast and light on their feet. The Iolathi moved in tight clusters, the adults carrying the juveniles, and Mara saw the fear in their wide, round eyes as they passed her, and she put her hand on each of their shoulders and said the same word over and over. Go, go, go! The Droon were the hardest, because they were slow and heavy, and many of them still did not believe what was happening, even as the black wall ate the sky behind them. Gorek had turned back to try to save one of his mineral extractors, and a falling support beam from a collapsing storage building caught him across the leg, and he went down hard, with a sound like a tree breaking. 2 human marines, a woman named Torres and a man named Pak, ran to him without hesitation and grabbed him under his massive arms and dragged him across the sand while he roared in pain, and the wind began to pick up around them, carrying the first stinging particles of what was coming. Counselor Theiss reached the shelter entrance and then stopped. She stood at the blast doors and looked at them, those thick, heavy doors that she had once called a curious redundancy. And something in her face broke, not with fear, but with the sudden, terrible weight of understanding that she had been wrong, and that her wrongness could have killed everyone. Mara appeared beside her, breathing hard and covered in dust. Inside, now, she said. Theiss looked at her, and for a moment the pride of 1,000 years of Selvari diplomatic tradition held her feet to the ground. Things about this place, Theiss whispered. I called it. You can apologize inside, Mara said, and she took the counselor by the arm and pulled her through the doors. The last group to enter was Mara's own, her and Dalton and Torres and Pak and 3 other humans who had stayed outside, until every single alien was accounted for, and through the doors. Mara stood at the entrance, and looked out at the world one last time. The black wall was close now, so close that she could see the individual shards of minerals spinning inside it, glinting with electrical discharge, and the sound it made was not wind, it was a roar, deep and grinding and endless, like the planet itself was screaming. She hit the door control, and the blast door slammed shut with a deep metallic boom that shook the floor beneath her feet. And then the storm hit. The sound was beyond anything any of them had ever experienced, a constant shrieking, grinding roar that vibrated through the walls and the floor and the ceiling, and through their bones and their teeth and their skulls. The lights flickered once and then held steady. The walls shook, but they did not crack. The air filters hummed louder as they worked to scrub the fine particles that found their way through the smallest gaps in the sealed doors. 217 beings from 7 worlds stood in the cramped corridors and chambers of the human whole, and listened to the planet try to tear itself apart outside, and nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was making jokes about human paranoia. Nobody was calling it a curious redundancy. The Iolathi juveniles were crying, and their parents held them close, and the Droon were pressing themselves against the walls, with their eyes shut tight, and the Selvari stood in perfect stillness, with their hands clasped together. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Mara Casson leaned against a wall and closed her eyes. Slow breath, because the shelter was holding, and the people were alive, and that was all that mattered. That was all that had ever mattered. The storm roared on and on and on, and the world above them was being erased, but down here in the dark and the noise and the fear, the lights held, and the air held, and the walls held, the human whole held. The storm did not stop. What every sensor model and atmospheric projection had suggested would be a violent but brief event, stretched into its 2nd hour, and then its 4th, and then its 8th. And by the time the first day ended, with no sign of the roaring outside getting any quieter, the mood inside the shelter had shifted from relief to something much heavier and harder to name. 217 beings were packed into a space designed for 120, and the air was warm and thick, with the breath and the heat and the smell of 7 different species pressed together in corridors and chambers that suddenly felt very small. Mara had not slept since the morning the storm hit, and she was running on coffee and willpower, and the knowledge that if she stopped moving even for a moment, the fear would catch up to her. And she could not afford that right now, because everyone was looking at her. Not at Counselor Fissy, not at Dr. Yeneth, not at Gorek, or any of the leaders and scientists and officials who had spent 6 months running this colony with calm authority and confident smiles. They were looking at the human woman who had built the hole in the ground. And so Mara became something she had never trained for and never wanted to be. She became the leader of everyone. In the first 12 hours, she organized the shelter into zones, assigning each species a section based on their size and needs and temperament. And she appointed team leads from every group to manage their own people and report back to her with problems before those problems became crises. The Droon were the first crisis. Their homeworld was a vast open landscape of rolling plains and wide skies. And they had evolved under conditions of endless space and freedom. Being underground in a sealed metal box was doing something terrible to their minds. By the end of the first day, 3 Droon were hyperventilating, had begun pounding on the walls with their massive fists, not out of anger, but out of a desperate primal need to be anywhere else. Mara went to them, and she did not try to calm them down with words, because she understood that words meant nothing to a brain that was drowning in its own terror. So instead, she opened the largest chamber in the shelter, and cleared it out, and hung sheets from the ceiling, to create the illusion of openness. and she set the lighting to a warm golden tone that mimicked the color of the Droon homeworld sky. It was not much, but it was enough, and the Droon breathing slowed, and the pounding stopped. And Gorek, sitting against the wall with his leg wrapped in bandages and his face tight with pain, looked at Mara with something that she had not seen in his eyes before. It was respect. The Selvari were a different kind of problem. They were not panicking, they were ashamed. And shame in the Selvari was a quiet poison that ate at them from their inside out. They had spent 6 months laughing at this shelter and dismissing the woman who built it. And now they were alive because of both, and the weight of that knowledge sat on their elegant shoulders like stones. Counselor Theiss withdrew into a corner and stopped speaking entirely, and when Mara came to check on her, she found the Selvari leader sitting perfectly still with her silver eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, like a statue of someone who had decided to disappear. "Counselor, I need you," Mara said, and she meant it. Theiss opened her eyes, and they were wet. "You need me for what?" she said. "I am the one who told everyone this place was unnecessary. And now you are the one who can tell your people that it is going to be okay," Mara said. "They are not listening to me because I am human. They will listen to you because you are Selvari. So please get up and be their leader right now, because I cannot do this alone." Looked at her for a long moment, and then she stood, and she straightened her robes, and she walked to where her people were gathered, and she began to speak to them in soft, steady tones that Mara could not understand, but could feel. And the tension in the Selvari section eased like a knot slowly coming undone. On the second day, the storm was still screaming outside, and the lights flickered twice, and the water recycler made a sound that Mara did not like, and she crawled into the maintenance shaft to fix it herself, because the only person she trusted completely with this shelter was herself. She found the problem: a filter clogged with fine mineral dust that had somehow gotten into the system, and she cleaned it and replaced it and crawled back out, covered in grime and sweat. Dalton was waiting with a water pouch and a look on his face that said he was worried about her. "When was the last time you slept?" he asked. "When was the last time the storm stopped?" Answered, and that was the end of that conversation. On the second night, the real crisis came. The outer ventilation shaft, the one that drew in air from above the surface and fed it through the filtration system before distributing it to the shelter, began to clog with mineral debris. The same electrically charged shards of rock and sand that were scouring the surface clean. The airflow dropped by 10% in the first hour, and 20% in the second, and Mara ran the numbers in her head, and the numbers said that at this rate they would have breathable air for 12 more hours, and after that the carbon dioxide would build up, and people would start getting headaches, and then dizzy, and then sleepy, and then they would not wake up. She stood in the main corridor and looked at the faces around her, and she made a decision. "I need volunteers to go into the upper maintenance crawl space and manually clear the ventilation shaft," she said. "It is going to be dangerous, tight and hot, and the shaft connects to the surface, so there will be noise and vibration from the storm, and it is not going to be pleasant." Silence. And then a heavy shuffling sound as Gorek pushed himself up from the floor, using the wall for support, his bandaged leg dragging beneath him. "I will go," he said. "Gorek, your leg." "My people are tunnelers," he said, and his voice was rough and strained, but there was iron underneath it. "We have been digging through rock since before your species learned to walk upright. A little crawl space is nothing." Mara looked at him, and he looked back, and something passed between them that did not need words. She assembled a team of 3 humans and Gorek, and they entered the crawl space together, and it was exactly as terrible as she had promised. A narrow metal tube that shook with the force of the storm above, and rang with the sound of mineral shards hitting the surface, like a million tiny hammers. Gorik moved through the tight space with a skill that amazed the humans, his thick fingers finding the blockage by touch in the dark, pulling clumps of compacted mineral debris free, and passing them back down the line while the tube shook around them and the roar of the storm filled their ears. It took 2 hours, and when they emerged, Gorik was bleeding from a dozen small cuts on his hands and arms, and the humans who had gone with him were shaking with exhaustion, but the airflow was restored, and the shelter breathed again. That night, Counselor Thys found Mara sitting alone in the monitoring room, staring at the atmospheric data streaming across the screen. "May I ask you something?" Thys said. Mara nodded. "Why do your people build like this, always expecting the worst, always preparing for disaster? Is it not exhausting to live that way?" Mara was quiet for a long time. "We did not survive because we were the strongest. There were animals on our world that were bigger and faster, and had better claws and better teeth and thicker skin." She paused. "We did not survive because we were the smartest either, not at first. At first, we were just small and soft, and frightened little things hiding in caves, while the world outside tried to eat us." She looked at Dissy. "We survived because we were afraid, and instead of letting the fear freeze us, we let it teach us. It taught us to build walls and store food, and watch the sky, and dig shelters, and plan for the thing that had not happened yet, but might happen tomorrow." Her voice dropped. "Every species in this colony evolved on a world that was mostly kind to them. Yours had no seasons, the Droon had no storms, the Iolothi never faced a natural disaster in their entire recorded history." She smiled, but it was a tired smile. "Earth tried to kill us every day for 200,000 years, ice ages and volcanoes. Earthquakes and floods and plagues and famines and asteroid impacts that blacked out the sky." She leaned back. "We are not paranoid, Counselor. We are experienced." On the morning of the 4th day, the sound changed. The roar softened to a moan, and then the moan softened to a whisper, and then the whisper faded into silence, and the silence was so sudden and so complete that for a moment nobody moved because they had forgotten what quiet sounded like. Mara checked the sensors, and then checked them again, and then a third time, because she did not trust good news. The storm was over. She stood up and turned to face the 216 beings who were all looking at her, and she said the only thing that mattered. The blast doors opened with a heavy grinding sound, and the light that poured in was not the warm golden glow of the twin suns that everyone remembered, but a pale, washed-out white that felt wrong and empty, like the color had been scraped out of the sky. Mara stepped out first, because that was what she had always done, and always would do. Go first, see the danger before anyone else, make sure the ground was solid before letting others walk on it. What she saw made her stop. The colony was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, not in need of repair. Gone, erased, as if a hand the size of a continent had reached down and wiped the surface clean, like chalk from a board. The Selvari solar arrays that had gleamed like silver wings were scattered across the desert in pieces so small they looked like metallic confetti, and the Droon mineral extractors that had been anchored deep in bedrock had been ripped free and buried under 20 feet of compacted sand. And the Iolothi atmospheric processors were nowhere to be seen at all, just gone, carried away by the wind to some unknown grave in the endless dunes. The landing pads were buried, the storage buildings were flattened, the mess hall where someone had been brewing coffee 4 days ago was a twisted skeleton of metal beams stripped of every wall and roof panel. The landscape itself had changed. Dunes that had stood for centuries were gone, and new ones had formed in different places, and the exposed bedrock that had been flat and stable was now scored with deep grooves cut by the mineral shards that the storm had driven across the surface like a billion tiny blades. Mara stood on the ridge and looked at all of it and said nothing, Behind her the others began to emerge, blinking and squinting in the harsh light, and one by one they saw what she saw, and one by one they fell silent. A Selvari woman dropped to her knees and covered her face with her hands. Droon Foreman, whose name Mara did not know, stood perfectly still, with his mouth open and his eyes wide and empty. An Iolathi juvenile tugged on her parent's arm and asked in a small voice why everything looked different, and the parent had no answer. Gorek limped out on a makeshift crutch that a human medic had fashioned from a storage shelf bracket, and he stood beside Mara, and he looked at the ruins, and he breathed out slowly through his wide nostrils. "Everything," he said quietly, "everything is gone." "Not everything," Mara said. He looked at her. "Not a single life was lost," she said. 217 went in, 217 came out. He was quiet for a long time, and then he nodded once, slow and heavy, and that nod carried more weight than any words could have. The Cooperative Council reconvened that afternoon, and they held their meeting in the only structure still standing on the entire planet, the shelter. Whole. The place that every species had mocked and dismissed and called a monument to human fear. The irony was not lost on anyone, and nobody mentioned it because some things are too obvious and too painful to say out loud. Counselor Theiss stood at the head of the table, and she was different now. The elegance was still there, but the pride had been replaced by something else, something that looked like honesty, raw and unpolished and hard-won. "I will not waste time with speeches," she said, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not. 4 days ago, I was the loudest voice in this room, calling the human shelter unnecessary, and I was wrong, completely and dangerously wrong, and my wrongness nearly cost every life in this colony. She paused. "I am proposing a new mandate for the Galactic Cooperative effective immediately," she said. "On every colony world, on every outpost, on every settlement regardless of planetary classification or survey data, a human-designed emergency shelter will be constructed before any other infrastructure." She looked around the table. Not after the solar arrays, not after the extractors, not after the processors, before all of it, first, always, on every world. The vote was called, and it passed 7-0, and when the number was announced, Mara felt something tighten in her chest that she had to breathe through very carefully, because she was not the kind of person who cried in public, and she was not about to start now. After the meeting, the room emptied slowly, and Mara stayed behind to review the shelter systems one more time, because that was who she was, and she would not stop being who she was just because the danger had passed. Gorek found her there, running a diagnostic on the water recycler. He stood in the doorway for a moment, leaning on his crutch and watching her work, and then he spoke. "My people have a word," he said. "Vethkar. It is old, from before we had technology, from when the Droon were still digging tunnels with their bare hands to shelter their young from the cold seasons." He shifted his weight, and his injured leg made him wince, but he did not stop. "It means the one who digs the hole before the flood, the one who does the work that no one understands until the water rises, the one who is mocked for their caution and proven right by the disaster." He looked at her, and his deep-set eyes were serious and warm. "It is the highest word we have for someone who is not Droon," he said, "and I give it to you, Mara Kassan, Vethkar." Mara held his gaze and she nodded, and she said thank you in a voice that was quieter than she intended. In the days that followed, the rebuilding began, and it began in a way that no one would have predicted 6 months ago. Every species worked on the shelter first. The Selvari, who had never touched a foundation mold in their lives, were mixing composite materials and pouring walls under the direction of human engineers, and their long, elegant fingers turned out to be remarkably good at the precise work of sealing joints and calibrating pressure locks. The Iolathi brought their atmospheric expertise to the air filtration design and improved it by 30%, adding sensors and backup systems that even Mara had not thought of. And they did it with a quiet, determined focus that said more than any apology ever could. The Droon tunneled. They tunneled with a joy and a purpose that transformed them from reluctant participants to the backbone of the entire construction effort. Their massive hands moving earth and rock with a speed and precision that left the humans standing in awe. And Gorak directed them from a chair, because his legs still would not hold him, but his voice carried through every tunnel and corridor like rolling thunder. Even the species that had contributed nothing to the original shelter, the ones who had been silent during the council votes and neutral during the debates, came forward now with materials and labor and skills that they offered freely and without being asked. The new shelter was twice the size of the original. It had chambers for every species designed to their specific needs, wide open spaces for the Droon, and tall airy rooms for the Selvari, and quiet enclosed pods for the Iolathi, and a kitchen that could prepare food for 7 different biologies. It was not just a bunker, it was a statement, a promise written in metal and rock and composite, that said, "We understand now. We will not forget. We will not be caught unprepared again." On the day the new shelter was completed, Mara stood on the ridge at sunset and watched the twin suns go down over a landscape that was still scarred and raw, but already beginning to show the first signs of a colony being reborn. Dalton stood beside her, the way he always did. "Are already calling it something different," he said. "Calling what something different?" "The shelter, the aliens, they stopped calling it the human whole. What are they calling it now?" "The Foundation." Mara smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. A young Selvari apprentice climbed the ridge and approached her with the careful, respectful steps of someone who was not sure if they were allowed to interrupt, but had decided to try anyway. "Engineer Casson," she said, "we are installing the nameplate on the main entrance tomorrow, and the council has asked if you would like to suggest a name for the new shelter." Mara looked out at the desert and the dunes and the beings of 7 worlds working side by side in the fading light, building something together that none of them would have built alone. She thought about her grandmother's storm cellar in Oklahoma, and about the Dust Bowl, and about ice ages, volcanoes, and every terrible, beautiful lesson that Earth had beaten into humanity's bones over 200,000 years of survival. She thought about the human whole, and the laughter, and the mockery, and the 6-to-1 votes, and she thought about Gorak dragging himself through a maintenance crawl space on a broken leg, and Thissy standing up to lead her people when her pride told her to sit down, and every single being who had walked through those blast doors, trusting a shelter they had been told was useless. And she thought about what a shelter really is, not walls and doors and filters, but the decision to protect each other, the choice to build something you hope you never need, because hope is not a plan, and fear is not a weakness, and preparation is the deepest form of love. "Home," she said. The apprentice tilted her head. "Just home," Mara said, and down below on the scarred surface of a planet that had tried its best to kill them all, 7 species kept building, together, in the last light of the twin suns, with the stars coming out one by one above them, like a sky full of promises that the universe keeps, whether it means to or not. The desert was quiet. The shelter was ready. And the humans, as always, had built it first.